My name is Linda. I'm 58 years old, and I've always been the kind of mom who gets a little too excited about birthdays. I still write grocery lists on sticky notes and forget where I put them. But when it comes to planning surprises, I give it everything I've got. That morning, I stood in my kitchen, balloons tucked in the corner and a cake hidden in the fridge, feeling the same jittery thrill I used to feel when my son was just a boy waiting for candles and presents. But this time was different. He's grown now, a man with his own life, his own routines. As I straightened the tablecloth and rehearsed how I'd jump out to yell surprise, something inside me flickered, a soft unease, like a draft through a closed window. I brushed it aside, telling myself it was nerves. I had no idea what was waiting once he walked through that door. Next came the birthday surprise that didn't go the way I imagined. I balanced the cake box in one hand and clutched a small wrapped gift in the other as I slipped into the back seat of my son's car. My heart raced with the thrill of the surprise. I could already imagine his face lighting up the way it used to when he was little, when I'd hide behind the living room couch with balloons and cheap party hats. The leather seat was cool beneath me, and I tried to steady my breath so I wouldn't laugh at my own silliness. The car smelled faintly of his cologne, sharp and grown up, so different from the sticky scent of chocolate frosting that used to linger on his fingers. I cradled the cake carefully, listening. Footsteps approached. Voices his and someone else's drifted closer, muffled at first, then sharper. At first I smiled, waiting for the moment, but the words that filtered in weren't about birthdays. They were cold, calculated, full of numbers and plans that cut through me like glass. My son's voice, steady and firm, joined with his business partners, weaving a conversation that made my chest tighten. They spoke of things that left no room for family, no space for trust. Memories flashed his sticky hands tugging at my sleeve, his laughter echoing in the kitchen, the nights I stayed up patching his jeans. Now all I heard was ambition and something darker beneath it. I pressed myself deeper into the seat, the gift digging into my palm. The warmth I carried into that car drained away, replaced by disbelief and a hollow ache. I knew I couldn't reveal myself. Not now. So I stayed hidden, silent, clutching the cake like it was the last piece of our old life together. That was the moment I began to overhear the betrayal. The leather pressed against my back as I tried to make myself smaller, the cake trembling in my hands. Their voices filled the car, low and certain, carrying words that didn't feel real at first. I caught fragments papers already signed. Power of attorney shifted. My home no longer mine. The details slotted together like cruel puzzle pieces. A nursing home, whispered almost casually. My future decided without me. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. This was my son. The boy who used to beg me for one more bedtime story, who once cried when he scraped his knee and reached for me as if I were his whole world. Now his tone was clipped, practical, dismissive. Each phrase I pieced together felt like ice sliding into my chest. I remembered his small hand wrapped around mine, sticky from lollipops. His proud grin when he first tied his shoes. The way he used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms. And yet, sitting there in that car, the man outside felt like a stranger, someone who could look at me not as a mother, but as a burden to be moved aside. My breath came shallow, sharp. I wanted to burst out, to demand how love could turn into this kind of betrayal. But my throat locked. Silence was my only shield. If I made a sound, they would know I had heard everything. So I stayed hidden, fingers digging into the cake box, my pulse thudding in my ears. Anger flickered under the heartbreak, a simmering fire I hadn't felt in years. When the car finally fell quiet, I slipped out the door as quietly as I had come. My hands shook, my legs felt weak, but inside, something had hardened. I knew I had to face the truth and find a way to uncover everything they were planning. That was the moment disbelief gave way to resolve, leading me into the collision of memories and reality. I kept seeing him as a boy, sunlight catching in his hair the first time I let go of the bicycle seat. His little body wobbled forward, and when he realized he was riding on his own, his laugh rang out like bells. I can still hear it if I close my eyes. But then the sound faded into the memory of cold words spoken in the car, about documents and power of attorney, about stripping me of my own home. That same laugh now felt like a ghost. Another memory rose, his small hands dusted with flour as we baked cookies together, the kitchen warm with sugar and cinnamon. He had grinned with pride when he pulled a tray from the oven, even if half the cookies were lopsided. I cherished those imperfect moments. They were ours, and yet, overlaid on that sweetness was the image of him now, a grown man calculating what to do with me, as if I were just another item on his to-do list. The contrast struck like a physical blow. The boy who once kissed me goodnight was now the man who planned to lock me away. The tug between memory and reality left me breathless. Part of me wanted to cling to the boy I raised, but the truth was clear. The man before me was no longer that child. As the ache settled deeper, something shifted inside me. I realized I could not afford to live in those memories anymore. If I wanted to protect myself, I had to face the reality head on. So I steadied my breath and told myself tomorrow. I began looking for answers. That was the first step toward my investigation, the bakery, the bank, and the trail of truth waiting to be uncovered. The first place I went was the bakery. I told myself it was just an errand, just bread for the week, but really, I wanted to see them together. The smell of yeast and sugar hung in the air, warm and familiar, but it didn't comfort me. My son stood by the counter with his partner, their heads close, their voices low, sharing a quiet laugh. I caught a look between them, something unspoken, something that didn't belong to me. It left me with a pit in my stomach, like I was intruding on a world I was never meant to see. I walked out with a loaf I barely tasted later, but the unease followed me home. At the bank, the atmosphere was the opposite: sterile, cold, humming with quiet machines. I asked for my records, hands steady on the outside, trembling inside. What I saw made my breath stop. My name had been shifted, no longer primary. Transfers. I never authorized drained accounts I had built over decades. Dates stared back at me, cruel and precise, lined up with the weeks when I could barely lift my head from grief. Even the signature scrawled on one form looked like mine, but I knew it wasn't. Shame washed over me first. How had I been so blind? Then anger followed, sharp and clean. I gathered every page, making copies, slipping them into a plain folder I clutched to my chest. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just paper, but proof of everything I had feared. At home, I spread the documents across my table, the ink stark against the wood. Slowly, carefully, I put them back in order, sliding them into a drawer I locked with a small key. It wasn't much, But it was a beginning, I whispered to myself, almost like a vow never again would I be caught unaware. That night, as I closed the drawer, I understood this was no longer just suspicion. This was betrayal in black and white, and it was only the beginning. The realization was setting in, pulling me toward the full weight of what my son had done. I sat at my table with the papers spread before me, the ink sharp and undeniable. Transfers, signatures, insurance beneficiaries all in neat rows that left no space for excuses. My own name pushed aside, my authority stripped away, my future planned without me. What I had overheard in whispers was now carved into paper. It was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was deliberate. For a moment, I told myself it couldn't be true. He was my son, the boy whose hand once clung to mine at crosswalks, whose laugh filled our kitchen. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, something innocent hidden beneath all this. But the documents refused to lie. Line after line. They told me the truth. I was nothing more than a burden to be managed, an account to be emptied, a life to be signed away. Grief hit first, heavy and suffocating. My chest ached as if I'd lost him long ago, and only now was I realizing it. Then anger rose, sharp and burning, cutting through the fog. How dare he reduce me to numbers? How dare he turn love into leverage? My hands shook as I gathered the papers back into their folder. But this time, it wasn't just from fear. Beneath the heartbreak, something steadier formed. A quiet strength I didn't know I still had. He thought I was powerless. He thought I would crumble. But I won't. I will not let this be the end of my story. I closed the drawer with a firm hand and whispered to myself, it's time to fight back. And with that, I began to think of who I could turn to, how I could plan, how I could reclaim what was mine. I didn't know where to turn at first. The papers were heavy in my hands, and so was the silence that followed me through the house. For a while, I sat in that silence, wondering if I was foolish to even think I could fight this. After all, it was my own son. Who would believe me? But when I finally reached out to an old friend who had always been steady, and to my sister who had seen me through darker days, I found something I hadn't expected. Calm voices reminding me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't weak, and I wasn't alone. They told me that what happened to me had a name: elder abuse, financial exploitation, words that sounded harsh, but real. Words that turned my confusion into something solid I could face. I began to see the shape of a plan. They urged me to gather everything I could: bank statements, insurance papers, even scraps of notes I'd scribbled down. They reminded me that the folder I had started was more than just paper. It was protection. They suggested elder law attorneys, people who specialized in untangling this kind of betrayal. For the first time, the path forward didn't look like a cliff. It looked like a climb, steep, but possible. As I sat with their words, I felt the balance shift inside me. I was still hurt, still trembling, but there was a spark now. A small flame that whispered, "You are not powerless." I looked again at the folder on my desk. This time, not as a symbol of loss, but as the beginning of my defense. I wasn't just mourning anymore. I was preparing. And with that quiet resolve, I knew the next step it was time to set the trap. I had rehearsed the moment 100 times in my head. Each version ended differently, sometimes with tears, sometimes with apologies, sometimes with the hug of reconciliation I secretly longed for. But when the time finally came, none of my imagined endings appeared. only a heavy silence between us, one that seemed to stretch wider than the years I had spent raising him. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what I knew. I laid out what I had discovered, the papers, the transfers, the whispers I had overheard. I expected shock, or shame, or at least some flicker of the boy who once clung to me when thunderstorms rattled the windows. Instead, what I saw was a wall smooth, cold, impenetrable. His expression was almost bored, as if my pain was nothing more than a nuisance. Inside me, waves crashed. Part of me begged to believe I was wrong, that there was an explanation. Another part felt the sharp sting of recognition. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. He dismissed my words with arrogance, brushed aside my feelings with the kind of casual cruelty only someone you love can inflict. The son I raised seemed to vanish before my eyes, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. I felt my voice break under the strain of trying to stay calm, to hold on to dignity when my heart was shattering. I had walked into the confrontation hoping for honesty. What I received was denial dressed in confidence, and a manipulative charm that only deepened the wound. When I finally walked away, my body felt weak, but my resolve had never been clearer. I could not rely on his conscience. If I wanted the truth, I would need undeniable proof. Quietly, with tears drying on my cheeks, I made a promise to myself the next time. I wouldn't come empty-handed. And that was the moment I knew I had to set a trap, and I had to unmask the truth with my own hands. I remember how my hands shook as I slipped the small recorder into place. It felt almost absurd, like something out of a spy movie. Yet this was my reality. I wasn't trying to catch a stranger. I was trying to catch my own son. That thought alone made my stomach twist, but I knew it had to be done. Without proof, I was just a grieving mother with suspicions. With proof, I would finally have something solid. The waiting was the hardest part. My heart thudded so loudly, I thought they might hear it through the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint murmur of voices made my pulse spike. I sat in the stillness, praying the device would capture what my ears had already heard once before. Later, when I pressed play, the dread returned. At first, it was just their voices casual, even amused. Then the words sharpened into knives. They spoke about me as if I were already gone. My house reduced to an asset. My savings divided like spoils. My independence dismissed as an inconvenience. The cruelty wasn't in the shouting. It was in the calm certainty. My son, the child I once tucked in with lullabies, spoke about moving me into a nursing home as though he were scheduling an errand. I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. The rewriting of my life as if I were nothing more than paperwork. Yet, in that devastation, a spark lit. Hearing it laid out in his own voice meant I was no longer imagining things. This was real, and now it was mine to hold. I sat there, recorder in my palm, my hands trembling but steadying with each breath. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, strength began to form. I finally had the truth, and I made a silent vow. Right then, I would not let their scheme bury me. I would use this weapon. The fight was only beginning, and I was no longer defenseless. It started subtly, almost like a shadow creeping in through the cracks. His voice carried that practiced tone of authority, the kind that made me second-guess myself. He reminded me of things I supposedly forgot, insisted that my memory was slipping. that I was imagining situations that had never happened. For a moment, I felt the ground beneath me tilt. Was I losing my mind? Was grief making me unreliable even to myself? Then came the sharper edges. Hints that if I didn't trust him, I would find myself cut off financially, emotionally, even within the family. He painted himself as the burdened son, the one carrying responsibilities, while I became a weight he had to manage. The words weren't shouted, they were carefully chosen, designed to coil around my confidence and squeeze it tight. I could feel myself shrinking under it, the air in the room growing thinner with every insinuation. My heart raced, my mind scrambled, and for a flicker of a second, I almost believed him. Almost. But then, like a lifeline, I remembered the recording. I remembered the cold certainty in his own voice, proof that what I heard was real. That memory steadied me. I clung to it as if it were a rope pulling me out of quicksand. My fear did not disappear, but it began to harden into something else: resistance. I stayed quiet on the outside, but inside, I was whispering a promise to myself: I will not let you erase me. His threats no longer sounded like absolute truths. They sounded like desperation. And if he was desperate, it meant I still had power. That night, lying awake, I realized the next step was clear. I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could help me shield what was mine. I needed allies. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I no longer felt entirely helpless. I felt ready to fight. For days, I carried the weight alone, afraid of what might happen if I spoke out. The threats echoed in my mind. The gaslighting still gnawed at my confidence. But eventually, the silence became heavier than the fear. I knew I had to reach for help. Walking into the lawyer's office, I felt exposed, almost ashamed that it had come to this. Yet the moment I explained my situation, something shifted. The lawyer specialized in protecting people like me, elders whose rights were quietly stripped away. Through steady words, I learned that I wasn't powerless. The papers I had gathered mattered. The recording mattered. There were laws in place, and I had standing to fight back. For the first time in weeks, I felt the fog of confusion begin to clear. Still, legal strength wasn't enough. I needed hearts beside mine. So I opened up carefully, quietly to a sister and 2 close friends. I expected judgment or pity, but instead, I found hands reaching toward me, voices telling me I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't alone. That affirmation steadied me more than I realized I needed. The shame began to loosen its grip. In its place grew something sturdier: resolve, with legal guidance in one hand and emotional support in the other. I no longer felt like prey circling in the dark. I had allies, I had truth, and I had the will to protect what was mine. I walked home that evening carrying not just folders of documents, but a new sense of strength. The storm hadn't passed. It was only beginning, but I wasn't stepping into it empty-handed anymore. The next test would come soon, and this time, I would be ready. It happened on a night that began so ordinary, I almost felt safe again. Then the crash came, glass shattering against the quiet, the unmistakable sound of someone forcing their way into my home. My sanctuary turned on me in an instant. My heart pounded so hard, I could hear it in my ears as I froze. Breath shallow, listening to footsteps that didn't belong. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear. It wasn't a stranger prowling through my living room, it was my own son. That thought paralyzed me, then pushed me forward. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands and dialed, whispering to myself that I had every right to be protected. The minutes stretched endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards sent adrenaline surging. I pictured him finding me, cornering me, ending any chance I had of reclaiming my life. Yet I held on to the phone, clinging to the lifeline that someone was on their way. When flashing lights finally painted my walls, the air in my lungs released in a rush. Officers filled the doorway, their presence shifting the balance instantly. My son's rage was no longer a private torment. It was out in the open, undeniable, seen by others who carried authority. Relief mingled with grief as I watched him being pulled back. The boy I once cradled, now treated as a threat. That night carved itself into me like a scar. I had felt terror in every bone, but I had also felt courage in my own defiance. Calling for help hadn't been weakness, it had been survival. And as word of what happened began to spread, I realized I was no longer the only witness. The world was starting to see what I had carried alone for too long. The legal battle that followed felt heavier than anything I had endured before. Walking into courtrooms with their cold walls and rigid schedules, I often wondered if I had the strength to keep going. Every filing, every meeting with lawyers drained me financially and emotionally, and yet I knew there was no other path forward. To surrender would mean erasing myself entirely, letting betrayal define the rest of my life. Facing my son across that room was the hardest part. He avoided my eyes, his posture stiff with arrogance, as if I were the one on trial. Each time I caught a glimpse of him, memories of birthday candles and bedtime stories flickered in my mind, only to be crushed by the weight of bank statements and legal documents. The turning point came when the recording was played. Hearing his own words calculated, cruel, undeniable, was like having the wound reopened, but it also brought validation. The silence in the courtroom after that moment told me everything. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. The truth was out, and it could no longer be dismissed. The hearings dragged on, filled with motions and testimony. But eventually, justice arrived. Restraining orders were granted. Financial restitution began to take shape. For the first time in months, I felt the law standing beside me instead of the shadows pressing in. Relief washed over me, though it was bittersweet. I had not won back my son. That bond was shattered beyond repair. What I had won was the right to stand in my own life without fear of being erased. As I left the courthouse, papers in hand, I felt a quiet closure settle in. Justice had been served, and now I could finally turn towards something new, reclaiming peace and moving on. 6 months later, I find myself standing in a place I never imagined, a community garden just a few blocks from my home. Rows of tomatoes and sunflowers stretch upward, their roots steady in the soil, their leaves reaching for the light. I run my hands through the dirt, and I can feel the difference in myself mirrored there. Something broken has been replanted. Something wounded has begun to bloom again. My days are quieter now, filled with small routines that bring a kind of peace I once thought was lost to me. I water seedlings in the morning, share cuttings with neighbors in the afternoon, and laugh with new friends over the simplest things, like the sweetness of a ripe strawberry or the stubbornness of weeds. These connections are tender but strong, and in them I've found a new kind of family. The betrayal still lingers in my memory, but it no longer defines me. I've learned that life can be reduced to papers and signatures, but it can also be rebuilt with hands in the soil, with kindness exchanged between strangers, with courage to keep showing up each day. This garden is more than a place of growth. It's proof that healing is possible. My life may carry scars, but those scars are the very places where resilience took root. If my story has touched you, if you've ever had to rebuild after being broken, I hope you'll carry this truth with you. Life can bloom again, and if you found strength in this journey, please like, share, and leave a comment. Your voice, like mine, can help someone else believe in new beginnings. Looking back, I realize this journey has been both the hardest and the most important season of my life. To be betrayed by someone you love more than yourself is a wound unlike any other. But I've learned that even in the deepest hurt, there can be growth. And even in the darkest night, there can be light. Family, I've discovered, is not only about blood, but about trust, respect, and love freely given. When those things are broken, it does not mean our worth is gone. It means we are called to protect ourselves, to rebuild, and to redefine what family means to us. If there's one lesson I carry now, it's this: resilience isn't about never falling. It's about rising again with strength you didn't know you had. Betrayal may have scarred me, but it also taught me to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to never surrender my voice. So if you are facing your own storm, please remember you are stronger than you think, and life still has chapters waiting to be written with hope. If this story touched you, I'd love for you to like, share, and leave a comment. Your voice matters too.